If his anatomical work had been published, it would have immediately superseded all existing medical texts. It would have jump-started physiology by at least a century. He even figured out the function of the aortic valve. He drew how it closed to prevent backflow, a concept the medical establishment didn't fully grasp until the 20th century. He figured out a basic law of physics over 200 years before Guillaume Montans independently rediscovered and published the same law in 1699.
Just think about the staggering efficiency gap this created.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're attempting the impossible, really.
We are.
Encapsulating the life and mind of a man who isn't just a historical figure, but, and this isn't an exaggeration, he's the very definition of genius, Leonardo da Vinci.
And when most people hear that name, Leonardo, they immediately picture the Mona Lisa, that serene, enigmatic face.
Or the drama of the Last Supper.
Exactly. He is, without a doubt, the world's most famous painter. But calling him just a painter is, well, it's like reducing a whole universe to a single star.
It is. He's the quintessential universal genius, the original Renaissance man. And our sources today, they span everything from his digitized notebooks to critical biographies, scientific journals, and they all paint this picture of a mind that was just constantly running at superhuman speed.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was a draftsman, an engineer, a scientist, anatomist, geologist, botanist, military strategist, an inventor. The art was almost the most visible output of this intensely empirical and experimental mind.
So our mission today is to look beyond those visual masterpieces, beyond the Mona Lisa, the Vitruvian Man, which is a cultural icon in itself.
Right.
And plunge into that vast, chaotic sea of his intellectual legacy, those 13,000 pages of notes that have survived.
And in those notes, we see a scientific pioneer who was decades, sometimes even centuries, ahead of his time.
We're investigating not just what he created, but the immense, world-altering knowledge he failed to publish.
Yes, and what that absence, what that silence meant for the course of Western science.
Okay, let's unpack this mind. And we have to start at the beginning, which was an incredibly unconventional start for someone who would reach his stature.
Leonardo was born in or near the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci. That's in 1452. It's about 20 miles from Florence. And the circumstances of his birth are just. They're critical to understanding his whole path.
He was born out of wedlock. Now, that wasn't necessarily catastrophic in Renaissance Florence, but it definitely set his early trajectory.
Precisely. His father was Ser Pier da Vinci, a very successful, very wealthy legal notary in Florence.
Yeah.
A profession that, required significant classical training.
And his mother.
His mother was Caterina di Meolipi. She's described as a lower-class woman, possibly a local peasant girl, maybe even a servant in the household.
And this lineage is what defines his name, isn't it?
Yeah.
His full name was Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci.
Right. It translates literally, Leonardo, son of Ser Piero, from Vinci. That Da Vinci part, it's just a geographical indicator. It's not a family name.
And because of that illegitimacy, he couldn't inherit the family name, and crucially, he was barred from the typical high-status careers.
Exactly. No law, no medicine, none of the things his father's family could have easily afforded for him.
Which brings up a really interesting point about his education, because despite being the son of a professional man, the sources all confirm he got a pretty basic, informal education.
Just vernacular reading, writing, and arithmetic. He completely lacked that rigorous classical training in Latin and Greek that defined every other humanist scholar of the time.
It's a huge paradox, isn't it? The greatest intellectual of his age had what we'd consider a minimal, formal education.
It is. And scholars have a theory about that. They hypothesize that his artistic talent was just so obvious, so early on, that his family and, society basically decided his path was clear.
Forget the textbooks, focus on the craft.
Exactly. And you could almost see it as a blessing in disguise. Because he didn't have the baggage of classical scholarship, he had memorized all the accepted and often very incorrect ancient theories.
So he was forced to rely on what he could see for himself, empirical observation.
He had to look at the world freshly, without any preconceptions.
And that fresh observation is what led him, around age 14, to Florence. He became a garzone, a studio boy.
In the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. And this was the place to be. Verrocchio was arguably the leading sculptor and painter in Florence.
So this apprenticeship, This was the real education of Leonardo da Vinci. It lasted about 7 years, and it was a crucible of learning that, few modern schools could even hope to replicate.
Absolutely. Baroccio's studio wasn't just an art school. It was like an applied technology center.
Yeah.
Leonardo was exposed to and trained in this huge range of technical and scientific skills.
So drafting, painting, sculpting, obviously.
Yes, but also chemistry for mixing pigments, metallurgy for bronze casting, metalworking, leatherworking, hydraulics, applied mechanics.
And he was surrounded by other future masters. The place was packed with brilliant people like Ghirlandaio, Perugino. Botticelli was around.
Florence was the epicenter. It was where art was really starting to fuse with science through the study of light and perspective.
And you can see his uniqueness almost immediately in his early work. Like his contribution to Verrocchio is the baptism of Christ.
Ah, yes. Painted around 1472, 1475. This is where we get that famous, very dramatic anecdote from the biographer Giorgio Vasari.
Right. Leonardo, still just a young apprentice, collaborates on the painting. He's tasked with contributing the young angel on the left, holding Jesus' robe.
And Vasari claims that Leonardo used the new technique of oil paint for that section. He achieved a softness, a subtle realism that was so technically superior to Verrocchio's own work in tempera,
that his master was completely demoralized. The legend says Verrocchio never painted again.
which, we love that story. And it definitely highlights Leonardo's overwhelming talent.
But it's almost certainly not true.
Right. It's likely apocryphal. Verrocchio continued to run his workshop and produce sculpture for years, but the story tells you something about the immediate, just seismic impression Leonardo made on everyone.
And that impression wasn't just about beauty, it was about a kind of visceral realism, which is captured perfectly in that other anecdote, the one about the buckler shield.
I love this story. It's such a window into his intellectual process.
So a local peasant gives Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, a plain wooden shield, a rotella, and asks him to get it painted. And Ser Piero just passes this humble little job on to his son.
And instead of painting, a pretty coat of arms or something, Leonardo uses it as this opportunity for scientific observation and terrifying creation.
He spends days gathering creatures, lizards, snakes, butterflies, grasshoppers.
And he combines them in his mind and then paints this truly horrific, fire-spitting monster, sort of inspired by the myth of Medusa, with smoke pouring from its nostril.
The sources describe how intense his concentration was. And when his father came to pick it up, Leonardo deliberately, sprang the shield on him in a dark room.
And Ser Piero recoiled in shock, which for Leonardo was the confirmation of its success.
He hadn't just painted a shield, he had painted a moment of pure, raw terror, and he'd achieved it through intense naturalistic study.
And Ser Piero, being a smart businessman, wisely bought the peasant a cheaper, non-terrifying shield.
And sold Leonardo's masterpiece to a Florentine art dealer for 100 ducats, a huge sum, who then sold it on to the Duke of Milan.
So that was his first major commercial sale. And it wasn't a nice portrait. It was a psychological study of fear.
An early lesson that his deepest observations, even when they were totally impractical for a farmer's shield, were immensely valuable.
So by 1472, he's completed his apprenticeship. He qualifies as a master in the Guild of St. Luke. And his earliest dated work we have, from 1473, is this pen and ink drawing of the Arno Valley. It already shows his command of landscape, his interest in topography.
But right away, we see a pattern emerge that will just define his entire career.
Yes, the brilliant, highly detailed preparatory work, followed by the abandonment of the final product.
He secures these two major commissions in Florence, an altarpiece for the Palazzo della Signoria and the Adoration of the Magi.
Both result in these magnificent preparatory drawings. They show revolutionary compositions, incredible studies of light and shadow, but both were ultimately left unfinished.
And this is a point that I think connects his art to his science. His curiosity often focused on the intellectual challenge.
Solving the problem.
Yes, solving the puzzle of composition or perspective or how light falls. And once that puzzle was solved in his mind, the tedious physical labor of actually transferring it to canvas, it seems like it just lost its appeal for him.
And that restlessness, I think, is what drove his biggest career move. Around 1482, he leaves Florence for Milan to work for Ludovico Sforza, the Duke.
And what's truly fascinating is his pitch. The letter he sent to Sforza.
Incredible.
He wasn't applying as a court artist, first and foremost. He was applying as a defense contractor.
That is exactly it. He wrote this famous letter detailing 10 separate capabilities, and 9 of them focused almost entirely on his skills as a military engineer.
Designing light and strong bridges, portable cannons, armored fighting vehicles.
Devising hydraulic pumps, constructing secret underground tunnels for sieges. He boasted, "I can carry out projects for you in architecture, sculpture, and engineering."
And only the 10th final bullet point, almost as an afterthought, mentions painting.
He basically marketed himself as this polymath consultant who could, also make nice pictures for the court if needed.
And Sforza bought it?
He did. Leonardo served the Duke from 1482 all the way to 1499. He even arrived with this unique gift, a silver string instrument that he had made, shaped like a horse's head.
Showing off his skills in mechanics, metallurgy, and music all at once.
Mm-hmm. And it was during this first Milanese period that he produced some of his most celebrated paintings, like the Virgin of the Rocks and, of course, the Last Supper.
Painted around 1495 to 1498.
Yes, for the refectory of the Santa Maria delle Grazie convent. And it's just a masterpiece of psychological drama. It captures that exact moment. Jesus says, "One of you will betray me."
He brilliantly organizes the chaos, grouping the apostles into these 4 distinct triads, and each apostle is reacting with a unique gesture of shock or debate or grief. And it all focuses your attention on that serene, central figure of Christ.
The composition is just unparalleled. But this is where Leonardo's scientific curiosity became an artistic tragedy.
He chose to experiment with his medium.
This is the curse of the experimental mind. To get the subtlety of light and shadow he wanted, that brilliant color, the same kind of blending he would later perfect in the Mona Lisa, he abandoned the reliable method of true fresco.
Right, true fresco requires painting on wet plaster. It's durable, but you have to work fast, be decisive. So what did Leonardo do instead?
He used tempera and oil paint over a ground of gesso, pitch, and mastic on a drywall. This gave him the freedom to work slowly, to make corrections, to achieve those fine gradients of sfumato.
But the paint never chemically bonded to the wall.
Exactly. It didn't bond, so the paint failed almost immediately. The surface started flaking within a few decades. We know that within 100 years, people were already describing the masterpiece as completely ruined.
Which led to centuries of repeated, invasive, and often disastrous attempts at restoration.
It's the ultimate example of the scientist sabotaging the artist. He prized that pursuit of technical freedom over permanence.
And the other great ambition of his Milanese years also ended in failure, but this time due to politics. The Gran Cavallo.
The Gran Cavallo, the Great Horse. It was a massive equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza, and it was maybe the most ambitious sculptural project of the entire Renaissance.
He worked on it for over a decade. It was supposed to be cast in bronze, and it was meant to surpass the famous statues by Donatello and his own former master, Verrocchio.
This wasn't just sculpture, it was a colossal feat of engineering to cast a statue of that size.
It was immense. He completed a full-scale clay model, which stood over 23 feet high. The logistics of casting it required a huge amount of bronze, all meticulously detailed in his notebooks.
But in 1494, disaster struck. Ludovico Sforza, who's facing military pressure from the French, took the 70 tons of metal that was allocated for the statue.
And melted it down to cast cannons.
Yep. So military necessity destroyed the very art project commissioned by the military patron. A profound irony.
And the clay model itself.
It was later used for target practice by French archers when they conquered Milan in 1499. It was completely destroyed. The ambition was lost. The monument was never cast.
So when Sforza was overthrown, Leonardo fled Milan. He traveled around a bit, but that military lifestyle he'd advertised, it seems it was hard to shake.
In 1502, he took on this astonishing role. He started serving Cesare Borgia, the notoriously ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI, as his chief military architect and engineer.
It was a temporary gig, but intense. He spent months traveling around central Italy, inspecting fortresses and drawing maps for Borgia's campaigns.
And this period produced some of his most technically advanced maps, like the town plan of Imola. These weren't artistic impressions. They were modern-looking, meticulously scaled, accurate topographic maps, essential for military logistics.
He was applying geometry to cartography decades before the field really caught up.
He even worked on these massive civil engineering schemes, like that famous plan to divert the Arno River, to give Florence a port and cut off rival Pisa from the sea.
So his work for Borgia really reinforced his standing as this master engineer. But when he finally returned to Florence around 1503, he began the painting that would define the rest of his life.
The Mona Lisa, the portrait of Lisa del Giocondo.
And this painting is really the culmination of his artistic and scientific integration. It's a work he carried with him for years, constantly refining it, never quite letting it go.
And its defining feature is sfumato. We define it simply as smoked or smoky. But let's really dig into what that meant scientifically for him.
It's more than just soft edges, right? It's an optical illusion.
Absolutely. Leonardo, through his studies of optics, understood that the human eye doesn't perceive distant objects or sharp edges in perfect focus. So sfumato is his technique of creating these subtle, almost imperceptible graduations of tone and color.
Especially around the eyes and the corners of the mouth.
Exactly. By eliminating hard, dark outlines, he managed to trick the eye. That's why the Mona Lisa's smile is famously elusive.
When you look directly at her lips, the smile kind of disappears into shadow.
But when you look at her eyes, the edges of the mouth seem to reappear in your peripheral vision. This ambiguity, created by tiny, calculated layers of paint, keeps the expression constantly shifting. It injects the subject with a psychological life that no other portrait of the time achieved.
That's why Vasari was so blown away. He said the painting's quality would make even the most confident master despair and lose heart. It wasn't just beautiful, it was psychologically revolutionary.
We've established him as this peerless artist and a brilliant military consultant. But the core tragedy and the source of his profound lost influence rests here, in the vast private world of his notebooks.
This section is the reason we call him the universal genius, and it's the reason we mourn what could have been.
The sheer volume is staggering. We have about 13,000 pages of surviving notes and drawings.
And these aren't finished books or published treatises, they are journals. Originally just loose papers recording his every thought, every observation, every design.
Everything. From detailed anatomical dissections and meteorological observations to designs for war machines, complex geological theories, botanical sketches, and yes, shopping lists and notes about who owed him money.
It's a raw, chaotic data dump of a relentlessly curious mind.
And the organization was, let's say, personal. His writing style is famous for a reason.
Most of the notebooks are written in mirror image cursive, left-handed, running from right to left, often using shorthand and private symbols.
The mechanical reason is clear, right? As a natural left-hander, writing right to left stops him from smudging the ink as he goes.
But what about the theory that it was a deliberate form of secrecy, a kind of encryption?
That theory is very compelling, especially when you think about the politically charged content of some of his designs. We're talking advanced weaponry and detailed maps of powerful rivals.
So while not smudging the ink was probably the main reason, the mirror script certainly served as a high-level form of code.
It ensured that this enormous intellectual treasury, containing revolutionary scientific truths, was effectively locked away, which compounds the tragedy of it never being published.
And that failure to publish is key. These works, they were entrusted mostly to his favorite pupil, Francesco Melzi, after his death. But they were hoarded, disorganized, and never shared with the scientific community. Think of the acceleration that was lost.
Let's start with the most dramatic example, anatomy. His interest started as an artist's need for precision, but it quickly became purely scientific.
He didn't just study muscles from the outside, he went deep. He eventually got permission, which was very difficult to obtain, to dissect human corpses in hospitals across Florence, Milan, and Rome.
The rigor of this work is astounding. He collaborated with an anatomy professor, Marcantonio della Torre, around 1510, and he produced over 240 hyper-detailed drawings for what was supposed to be a definitive treatise on the human body.
And these weren't just drawings, they were methodological breakthroughs. He invented the use of cross-sections, layers, multiple perspectives, the first use of the exploded view in a medical context.
His achievements were genuinely revolutionary. He made one of the first scientifically accurate drawings of a fetus in utero, based on his dissection of a pregnant woman.
And crucially, he moved far beyond the dominant, centuries-old Galenic view of anatomy.
The Galenic view, from the ancient Roman physician Galen, had held sway for over 1,000 years, and it was filled with errors, like believing the liver was the center of the circulatory system.
But Leonardo correctly identified the heart as the central pump.
Exactly. He studied muscular forces, the skeleton, applying biomechanics to understand the body as a machine. He even documented complex conditions like atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, and liver cirrhosis, decades before they were properly categorized.
He even figured out the function of the aortic valve. He drew how it closed to prevent backflow, a concept the medical establishment didn't fully grasp until the 20th century.
He even used melted wax injections to cast the interior shape of the brain's ventricles. a breathtaking innovation for visualizing internal structures.
If his anatomical work had been published, it would have immediately superseded all existing medical texts. It would have jump-started physiology by at least a century.
And shifting to engineering, he didn't just design machines, he produced the first forms of modern technical drawing.
His notebooks are overflowing with designs: hydraulic pumps, weaving machines, reversible crank mechanisms, a self-propelled cart, which is essentially a blueprint for an early automobile.
And of course, there's his enduring obsession with flight, detailed in his codex on the flight of birds.
He was deeply analytical, studying the aerodynamics of bird flight. He produced designs for two main types of flying machines. First, the flapping ornithopter, which mimicked bird wings.
Though it was almost certainly too heavy and complex for human power to work.
And second, the helical rotor, the aerial screw.
Yes, the helical rotor. This design looks exactly like the earliest conceptual drawings of a helicopter. It was based on using a spinning screw to compress air and generate lift.
Unfeasible with the materials of 1500, but the concept was fundamentally sound.
And it predates the actual invention by 4 centuries. He wasn't just dreaming, he was engineering a solution.
But the most stunning example of lost knowledge, the clearest measure of the delay caused by his secrecy, involves something that sounds simple: friction.
This is one of the foundational laws of physics. It's often attributed to the late 17th century.
But Leonardo, inspired by his study of perpetual motion machines, which he correctly concluded were impossible, started analyzing the fundamental forces of resistance in nature.
And in 1493, he wrote down the fundamental laws of sliding friction.
He stated that the force of friction is proportional to the load pressing the surfaces together, and that it's independent of the size of the contact area.
This discovery is absolutely critical for mechanical engineering. It allows you to calculate energy loss.
So he figured out a basic law of physics over 200 years before Guillaume Montons independently rediscovered and published the same law in 1699.
Just think about the staggering efficiency gap this created. 2 centuries where engineers and machine designers operated without this crucial understanding. All because Leonardo's notes sat in mirror script, tucked away in private collections.
The sheer volume of lost scientific time, it's the defining tragedy of Leonardo da Vinci.
So by 1513, Leonardo's in his 60s. He relocates to Rome, working briefly for Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of Pope Leo X.
And this period really highlights the growing tension between what his patrons wanted and his own obsession with pure research.
He was given a residency in the Belvedere courtyard, a very active place where Michelangelo and Raphael were also working. But the friction between him and the papacy became immediate.
Pope Leo X commissions a painting, but Leonardo never starts it. Why?
Because he became totally absorbed in developing a new type of varnish, a highly technical chemical process. The Pope became famously frustrated, complaining, "This man will never accomplish anything. He thinks of the end before the beginning."
That quote perfectly encapsulates the professional struggle of the universal genius. The patron wants the finished product, the art.
But Leonardo prioritized the intellectual challenge, the process, the formula, the science of making it perfect, even if that meant delaying the work itself indefinitely.
And that kind of genius-level procrastination, driven by endless curiosity, it made him unpopular with some patrons.
But it ultimately attracted the most sophisticated one of all, King Francis I of France.
In 1516, Leonardo accepts the king's invitation. He becomes premier painter and engineer and architect to the king. He spends his final 3 years in this comfortable residence at the manor house Clos Lucé, near the Château d'Amboise.
And Francis I was utterly devoted to him. He gave him a huge pension and total freedom from commissions. The king just appreciated the philosophical spectacle of having the master near him, whether he produced finished work or not.
And Leonardo fulfilled that role perfectly. He acted as a kind of royal party planner and spectacular mechanical designer. This is where he created that famous mechanical lion.
The sources describe this amazing pageant. Leonardo constructed a mechanical lion that could actually walk toward the king. When it was struck with a wand, the lion's chest opened up to reveal a cluster of fleur-de-lis, the French royal emblem.
Pure theater, powered by his engineering genius right at the end of his life.
But despite that flash of brilliance, his capacity for execution really began to diminish during this final period. There's clear evidence of physical decline.
Yes. A major source from 1517 describes him as suffering from a paralysis of the right hand, which strongly suggests a stroke. We also have a telling drawing by his pupil, Giovanni Ambrogio Figino, that depicts an elderly Leonardo with his right arm carefully wrapped up in his clothing.
So if the Mona Lisa was indeed one of the paintings he carried with him to France, this paralysis would explain why works like it, or his St. John the Baptist, remained technically unfinished. He literally could no longer hold the brush with his primary painting hand.
He died at Clos-Lucé on May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67.
The romanticized account by Vasari, claiming King Francis I, held his head in his final moments. That's now largely dismissed as a beautiful myth. The king was elsewhere at the time.
But his will tells us a lot. His favorite pupil and lifelong companion, Francesco Melzi, was his principal heir. He received the paintings, tools, library, and most importantly, all those thousands of pages of notebooks.
And Melzi's inheritance of the notebooks set the stage for the centuries of scientific obscurity we've been talking about. He faithfully preserved them, but he never managed to organize or publish them. He just allowed them to disperse and gather dust after his own death.
Which brings us to the final, lingering mysteries surrounding Leonardo, his physical remains.
He was initially buried in the Collegiate Church of St. Florentin at the Château d'Amboise. But history intervened violently. During the French Revolution, the church was demolished, the graves were scattered, leaving the precise location of his body unclear.
So after defining the human form so beautifully, the universal genius's final resting place is unknown.
Well, highly disputed. In 1863, an excavation took place at the site. They found a partially complete skeleton, along with fragments inscribed Leonardo Da Vinci and a bronze ring.
And the skeleton had an unusually large skull, which fits the profile.
It does. These remains were reinterred in the smaller chapel of Saint Hubert in 1874. But the plaque above the tomb is careful to state that the contents are only presumed to be Leonardo's.
And I understand this historical cold case is actually being pursued with cutting-edge science today.
Absolutely. There's an ongoing effort involving DNA testing. Researchers are trying to compare samples from the presumed remains with DNA found on his surviving work like fingerprint smudges or hair fragments in the paint, and also with descendants of his half-brother Domenico.
An incredible modern effort to confirm the identity of the Renaissance's most mysterious genius.
But regardless of where his bones are, the admiration for his mind remains absolute. And his final patron, Francis I, gave us the perfect summary 20 years after Leonardo's death.
Francis I stated, "There had never been another man born in the world who knew as much as Leonardo. Not so much about painting, sculpture, and architecture, as that he was a very great philosopher."
That's the ultimate acknowledgement, isn't it? The king explicitly prioritized his philosophical, his scientific, his engineering knowledge over his artistic output.
And that takes us full circle back to our objective today. Leonardo's legacy isn't just in the perfection of the Mona Lisa or the drama of the Last Supper.
It's in his relentless empirical drive, his ability to fuse art and science through rigorous, methodological observation. He is the ultimate exemplar of the Renaissance ideal. He embodies the sheer, exhilarating joy of discovery, even if the world wasn't quite ready to receive those discoveries yet.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to take away.
The concept of lost time here is profound. If Leonardo had successfully published just a fraction of those 13,000 pages of notes, if his detailed anatomical findings had replaced Galen, if his laws of friction had entered the common engineering lexicon, if his advanced technical drawings had been disseminated, how would the history of science have changed?
Would the Industrial Revolution have been accelerated by a century? Maybe more?
The knowledge was there. It was written down, fully understood, but it was essentially locked away from the world. A combination of personal secrecy, that idiosyncratic writing, and a failure of later organization.
The great challenge of a universal genius like Leonardo is managing the sheer volume and diversity of their output.
And we are left to wonder what other brilliant, revolutionary, but unpublished works might still be hidden away in history simply because the genius behind them was too busy creating the next, equally profound thing to ever publish the last.
A fascinating, and I have to say, a slightly frustrating concept to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the truly universal mind of Leonardo da Vinci.